Praise God, give thanks to the Father in all that you say and do, well, amen.
And so as we think again, like we did last time, about events leading up now to this third saying, very soon after Jesus was nailed to the cross, we talked about this, that he said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Well, again, that's just hard for us to put our mind there, and yet that's what we're challenged to do. Remember when Stephen was stoned to death, as he was dying, he asked Jesus to receive his spirit and to forgive them. They didn't know what they were doing. In this time, when he was saying, Father, forgive them, the soldiers were dividing his garments. And then his coat, remember, didn't have a seam in it. They didn't want to tear it, so they cast lots for that. Well, that's interesting about that. Roman law, again, according to this same Bible background commentary, Roman law, as later codified in their legal digest, granted the soldiers the right to the clothes the executed man was wearing. It was customary to execute the condemned man naked. The basic unit of the Roman army was the contubernum, composed of 8 soldiers who shared a tent. Half units of 4 soldiers each were sometimes assigned to special tasks such as execution guards. It seemed that's what Jesus had, was 4 soldiers assigned to him. Soldiers of a contubernum shared a tent and were rewarded or punished together. If one member of the contubernum attacked or acted dishonorably in battle, that unit, that contubernum, would suffer decimation, whereby the group would be required to draw straws. The soldier unlucky enough to draw the short straw was then stoned to death by the others. That was just a hard reality that those soldiers had. Death was, I don't know, it was like, not that it was mocked, but it was so little thought of, the agony that they were witnessing. When as a soldier, if you did something that your superiors didn't like, your fellow soldiers may have to literally stone you to death. And so that was the world in which they lived, and it helps me better understand how they can just laugh and mock at somebody who was probably a bloody person from head to toe, hanging on a cross, and they could just have a good time with it. It's hard for us to relate to that. Ridicule was one of the sufferings inflicted on a naked man hanging on a cross. You think about, we mentioned this before, how Satan would do Jesus, had done Jesus, when he tempted Jesus in the wilderness. Remember, he would say, if you're the Son of God, command these stones to become bread. Just taunting Jesus, trying to goad him into misusing who he was. The second time he did that, then he brought him to Jerusalem, set him on the pinnacle of the temple, and said to him, if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down from here. If you are the Son of God. Well, remember the second saying. He looks at the thief and says, today you will be with me in paradise. Now, originally, both thieves were saying, if you're who you say you are, save yourself and us too. As the crowd was mockingly saying that to Jesus. And finally, it seemed one of the thieves had a change of heart. And he says, remember me, Lord, when you come into your kingdom. And he said, today you will be with me in paradise. And that was the saying we looked at last Lord's Day. We'll go to John chapter 19 now. Go to John 19. John is the only one that records this saying. But in John 19, and starting at verse 25. It says, now there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother, and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing by, he said to his mother, woman, behold your son. Then he said to the disciple, behold your mother. And from that hour, that disciple took her to his own home. There are a lot of things we can learn from this, I think. Can you imagine as they are standing there, there's Jesus' closest family was there, his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. His mother's sister seems to be the mother of John. But continuing on, well, there are 3 or 4 women, though. You know, the way that these read, sometimes it's hard to figure out. Now, these women were there, but there was a lot of Marys. And then the way the commas go and the way the sentence is structured, it's sometimes hard to know if it's referring to one woman, the mother of 2 of the ones mentioned, or just what. And as you look at those, just as a note of interest here, Matthew says Mary Magdalene, and Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee. Doesn't mention Jesus' mother at all. Mark says Mary Magdalene, and Mary the mother of James Celeste, and of Joseph. And so in Mark's account, Mary the mother of James Celeste and of Joseph, was she the mother of James and Joseph, or was this 2 different women? And then it mentions Salome. Salome is probably the name of Mary's sister. But anyway, in John's account, he says his mother. Well, that's just the first time Mary, the mother of Jesus, is mentioned as being there. But she has to be there because Jesus is going to talk to her. So we know that she was there. So there was his mother, and Mary Magdalene, Mary the wife of Clopas, and then it says the sister of Jesus' mother. And so it's a little sometimes hard to figure out who is who, but there they are watching Jesus suffer like this. Can you imagine watching your child go through this? The anger and the hurt and the not even wanting to look, and yet you've got to be there. You want to be there. And there's your son, your firstborn. And there's a lot of things you know about this firstborn. You know how he came into the world. You know there's something special about him, and yet there he is, hanging on a cross. And then Jesus, it says, saw his mother. Sometimes we get the image of a cross being way up. You know, it's just hoisted way up in the air. And history says that, no, that's not the case. They were probably only a few inches off the ground, enough to suspend the body in the air, but it wouldn't be that high up at all. And so when Jesus is looking at the soldiers dividing his clothing, they're right there. And then it says he looked, and there he saw his mother. I don't know, it doesn't say the distance, but height-wise, it would not be that far. And so there he sees his mother. And with his mother, it's going to be the disciple standing there with her whom he loved. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. The disciple whom he loved. Now you think, well, he loved all of his disciples. But there was one disciple that was always referred to in the book of John as the one whom he loved. There are also others in the group that are not named. We don't know who they were. But there were some others there to be there, maybe to be there with Mary, the mother, trying to give comfort. And so there they were in this group. The disciple whom Jesus loved is obviously John. Now, there are reasons to believe that. John, for instance, in his own writing, he wrote the book of John, and then 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and Revelation. John never uses his name, nor the names of his family. The only exception to that would be his brother, James, and Jesus. And evidently, John and Jesus were probably cousins. And so John just never uses his own name. But he uses this phrase, the disciple whom Jesus loved, 4 times. None of the other writers refer to anybody that way. But John does. And so he's not using his own name, and that's not unusual. You read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, not so much mention of their own name. Read the other epistles, they might mention themselves occasionally, but they don't typically use their own name very often. When you go to the end of the book of John, and John chapter 21, you'll find that the writer there of the book of John identifies himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. The Lord had been questioning Peter. Remember, Peter denied Jesus 3 times. And now the Lord is bringing him back into the fold, you might say. And he's asking Peter, do you love me? Yes, Lord, you know I love you. And he asked him that 3 times, remember. Well, I always got the impression from that they were sitting around the fire. Jesus had actually made breakfast for his disciples. They were sitting around the fire and they were eating. And I kind of thought that's where that conversation probably happened. Well, it happened right after that as they were walking along. So I can just imagine Peter walking along with Jesus and the Lord asking Peter, do you love me? Yes, Lord, you know I love you. And 3 times. Then it says following. So there was a disciple back there following them. It says this. Then Peter, turning around, saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following, who also leaned on his breast at the supper and said, Lord, who is the one who betrays you? And then in verse 24, this is the disciple who testifies of these things and wrote these things. And we know that his testimony is true. So the disciple whom Jesus loved is the disciple who wrote the Gospel of John. And John wrote the Gospel of John. And so there is this John, the one that Jesus loved, had a special connection with this disciple, standing there with Jesus' mother. And it's that disciple that the Lord's going to place his mother into the care of. Can you imagine? Who would you trust with your mother? He trusted John. And again, I can't imagine the circumstances. You're seeing your child beaten and ridiculed and mocked, made fun of. And you're having to watch this. I wonder if Mary, as she's watching all this, maybe thinks about some words she heard when Jesus was about 40 days old. Jesus had been born. He was circumcised on the 8th day. They had to go, Mary would have been considered unclean for about 40 days. And then they would be taken, the baby would be taken some point to the temple. And an offering made and the terms of the old law met. And so there they are. And there are 2 people there that Luke tells us about. One was a woman named Anna and another a man named Simeon. They were both very well up in years. And I wonder if Mary might be thinking about what these 2 say to her. And with Simeon blessed them and said to Mary his mother, behold, this child is destined for the fall and rising of many in Israel, and for a sign which will be spoken against. And then kind of a side note to his mother, yes, a sword will pierce through your own soul also, that the thoughts of many hearts may be revealed. I wonder if Mary might be thinking something about this. That sword going through her own soul might feel pretty real about this time. And certainly the Lord revealed the hearts of many in his teaching and preaching, and even to this day through the gospel. We know that, what little we do know, we know this about Jesus, that he was a good child. Now, we talked about this in Bible study this morning. Here's this mother looking at her son. I don't know what else she's thinking about, but she could be thinking too, he was a good boy. He doesn't deserve this. He was a good child. Luke tells us that. If we go back to Luke chapter 2, Luke tells us the most in detail about the birth of Jesus and all of that. And in Luke chapter 2 and in verse 39, this was when Mary was visiting Elizabeth. Now Mary arose in those days and went into the hill country and there he meets up with Elizabeth. But that is not the passage that I wanted. Okay, we'll it's right after. Is it which verse, Mike? All right. I wrote the wrong chapter down, and that's usually when I do something like that. It's either Luke 1 or it's Luke 3, but it's not Luke 2. So I appreciate that. And so in Luke 1, we read it. Was where I was reading from somehow. And Luke 2 in verse 39. So when they had performed all things according to the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee to his own city of Nazareth. And the child grew and became strong in spirit and filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. And so they had heard from Simeon, they had heard from Anna. Simeon, just had that about the sword piercing Mary's soul. And then Luke tells us, but he was a good boy. He was a good child. We talked about this morning. Can you imagine raising God's son? And then you imagine what kind of child would this be? I mean, he's the Son of God. Would he be humble? Would he be obedient to his parents? Would he listen? Could you tell him anything? And evidently, he was just a good boy. And at age 12, he goes to Jerusalem with his parents, still in Luke chapter 2. Let me read from the right chapter this time. And Luke chapter 2, and in verse 42. When he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem according to the custom of the feast. And then that was a very busy time, and often families travel together. And so in all the busyness, they get ready to go home. They don't realize that Jesus is not in their company. They're all traveling together. And when they realize it, you can imagine, you lose your child. They didn't have an Amber Alert, they couldn't put out the word except word of mouth. And so they finally found him after 3 days. And they find him in the temple. Of course, Jesus is amazing everybody there with his knowledge, with questions he's asking and answering. But when his parents wondered, how could you do that? Didn't you know we would be worried about you? We've sought you anxiously. And he said to them, why did you seek me? Did you not know that I must be about my Father's business? Like in Jesus' mind, you should have started here at the temple. You ought to know I'd have to be about my Father's business. But there again was that kind of that sign, that hint of things yet to come. And it just says after that, he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was subject to them. But his mother kept all these things in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. And so he was a good young man. He subjected himself to his parents. He was well liked by other people. And now Mary is seeing this good child, this son, this one that she knew who the miraculous means by which he even came to be. And there he is on the cross. And none of them fully understood the story of the cross. They were still looking for the kingdom to come, just like the thief on the cross was looking. Lord, when you come into your kingdom, remember me. Then Jesus, after this, he makes sure his mom is taken care of. He had said, woman, behold your son. But he's going to make sure that she's taken care of. Because who's the son now? Woman, behold your son. She's standing there with John. And there were some other people around. She's there with John. Woman, behold your son. He has given responsibility of his mother to his disciple whom he loves. Behold your son. Most likely Joseph, the supposedly earthly father of Jesus, though we know he wasn't, but Mary's husband, had probably been dead for some time. All signs point that at some point Joseph passed away. And so there is that need now. Now the firstborn, Jesus, is dying on the cross. Who's going to take care of Mary? Now Jesus had other brothers. And isn't it interesting that he didn't turn his mother over to them? He had a brother named James. He had one named Jude. He had sisters. And yet they at that time did not believe in him. They'll come to, at least some of them. But at that time they didn't. And he turns the care of his mother, the responsibility of his mother, over to John. He directs her to look upon John as her son. Woman, behold your son. And at one time I had the idea, for some reason, I'd read this, and I'd be thinking that Jesus just wants his mother to, here I am, behold your son. But he's talking about John. John, this is your mother now. Mother, this is your son now, John. The Lord teaches that children are to provide to the utmost of their power for the comfort of their aged parents. The Lord has used Old Testament passages to talk about the principle of the child honoring their father and their mother. And so when he is saying, woman, behold your son, he's saying to John, I want you to have that sense of responsibility like a child would have for their parent, to take care of them. Now, the Bible doesn't give us a lot of parent-child relationships, but what we are told has a lot to do with the responsibility of honoring your father and mother, for instance. I think about King David. King David was on the run. King Saul was trying to find him, trying to kill him. But remember how David took care of his parents? And 1 Samuel chapter 22, verse 3, then David went from there to Mizpah of Moab, and he said to the king of Moab, please let my father and mother come here with you, till I know what God will do for me. So he brought them before the king of Moab, and they dwelt with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. And so we have that example. David wanted to make sure my parents are okay. What a great responsibility that is for us. Think about what this would mean to John. He now has the financial responsibility of Mary, the mother of Jesus. There were times that a relative would not take up the widow of another relative like the law would prescribe to raise up a child in the name of the deceased family member because it would upset their inheritance. It upset them financially. And so they wouldn't take on the responsibility that should be theirs. Well, John was given the responsibility to take care of Jesus' mother. But he just took it. The expense, the effort, what might it do to his own family? Well, we're not told that there was ever any question in his mind at all. And so those that truly love Christ, as he did, were looking for opportunities, ways to serve him. There's a saying in early church history, and here's one of that, and I'm not sure if you say Nicephorus here in his history, saith that Mary lived with John at Jerusalem 11 years and then died. Others say that she lived to remove with him to Ephesus. There is early church history, non-inspired history, that says that Mary moved with John to Ephesus until she died there later. We don't know, but we do know John was given the care of Jesus' mother. Behold your mother. The Lord had no patience with people who did not take care of their parents. This is evident in discussions like in Matthew chapter 15. Remember when they were being criticized because the disciples didn't wash their hands first? That was not in the law. That was in the tradition of the elders. And the Lord said this in verse 3 in Matthew 15. He answered and said to them, why do you also transgress the commandment of God because of your tradition? For God commanded, saying, honor your father and your mother. And he who curses father or mother, let him be put to death. But you say, whoever says to his father or mother, whatever profit you might have received from me is a gift to God, then he need not honor his father or mother. Thus, you have made the commandment of God of no effect by your tradition, hypocrites. That's a pretty strong word, isn't it? For the Lord to say, you bunch of hypocrites. You're worried that we don't wash our hands before we eat, which is not in the law, by the way. And yet you would negate one of the 10 commandments, honor your father and mother. No, the Lord had no patience for that. We find that teaching repeated. I'm going to Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 1, but I really don't need to turn there. I could ask the kids right now, would you say for me Ephesians chapter 6 verse 1? And they all would say, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. And then they've learned in the second verse, aren't they? Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise. And then they're going to add the third verse, that it may be well with you, and you may live long on the earth. And then verse 4, I turn around and talk to fathers. But children, obey your parents in the Lord. Honor your father and your mother, which is the first commandment with promise. When Paul was writing to Timothy about how to make sure that widows were not being neglected, and he would give the guidelines for who would truly be considered a widow that the church could take under its care in a financial way. And he said, but there are certain things that you need to look at first. First responsibility to take care of a widow is the widow's family. And so in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 4, but if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and to repay their parents, for this is good and acceptable before God. The first line financially for that widow was to be their children. And then the closest kin from that, family, to take care of family. Down in verse 8, it says, but if anyone does not provide for his own, especially for those of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. You take care of your own. Jesus is on the cross. Let's go back to our Lord. Suffering unimaginably, and yet wants to make sure his mother is taken care of. And he does. And thankfully, John fulfills that request from all accounts that the Lord made. But there's another point I think that we need to make before we close. The Lord would also teach, but no disrespect to his mother, that the Lord comes first. Even before mom and dad, the Lord comes first. God comes first. In Matthew chapter 12, in verse 46, it says, while he was still talking to the multitudes, behold, his mother now, the one we're talking about, they're on the cross. Woman, behold your son, John. John, behold your mother. That's Mary. This same mother came with his brothers, like James or Jude, and they wanted to speak to Jesus. Then one said to Jesus, look, your mother and your brothers are standing outside seeking to speak with you. But he answered and said to the one who told him, who is my mother and who are my brothers? And he stretched out his hand toward his disciples and said, here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. See where the Lord put the emphasis? The spiritual comes first before the physical. It's not that you disrespect, you dishonor anything, your physical family, but if you had to choose between the two, who do you go with? The Lord said, go with the one who does the will of his Father. Let's continue that to another passage. In Matthew chapter 10, the Lord said in verse 34, do not think that I came to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's enemies shall be those of his own household. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he who does not take his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. He who finds his life will lose it. He who loses his life for my sake will find it. Do you see the emphasis that the Lord puts? He said, I know it's going to be times that you're going to have to go against your family. But if you don't, if you choose family over me, you're not worthy of me. Matthew 19 and verse 29, the Lord said, everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or wife or children or lands for my name's sake shall receive 100-fold and inherit eternal life. But many who are first will be last and the last first. And you see what has happened? The Lord knows this is what's going to happen. There are going to be people who will lose their physical family, their fleshly family, because they chose me. In that day and time, among pagans and among Jews, that family religion was passed from one generation down to the next. Typically, it was the firstborn who had the responsibility of maintaining the family religion. Jesus was the firstborn, by the way, but that's a side note. And so when a woman, for instance, got married, she was expected to take on the religion, whatever it was, of her husband and his family. And so to turn your back on that, to say, listen, I'm not worshiping idols anymore, or listen, I'm not following the law of Moses anymore, I'm going to be a Christian. Well, none of your family are Christians. How dare you? And so often that means you have left houses, or brothers, or sister, or father, or mother, or wife, or children. It comes down sometimes just that strong, that you've got to follow the Lord. You cannot love anyone more than He. So even while on the cross, in more agony than we can possibly imagine, Jesus was concerned for His mother. Yes, there could be hard decisions that come. If it comes between a choice between God and family, physical family, better go with God. But the Lord was concerned about His mother. And sometimes we allow the busyness of our everyday lives to cause us to forget ours. I wonder, Tree's sitting here, but I wonder if I ask her, not that I'd ask her right this minute, but if I ask her, how many residents do you have in the nursing home that don't have anybody to come see them? Could ask Emily. She probably knows. I'm not asked that, but I imagine there's some. Don't have anybody to come see them. And probably some with children. Don't come see them. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise. Don't let anything except the Lord hinder you from honoring your father and mother. The first three sayings of Christ have all been for the benefit of others, not Himself. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Or today He tells the thief, you will be with me in paradise. And this time He was concerned about His mother. Woman, behold your son. Behold your mother. Next time we'll, Lord willing, continue on with the fourth saying. And it changes gears a little bit, you might say, but it's very important. I appreciate your good attention. We want to turn to the song that Brandon has selected. Let me encourage all of us, put the Lord first. Many people have not become Christians because of concern for their physical family. What will they think? What will their reaction be? I faced that with Bonnie early on when we were dating. She was very concerned about that. And sometimes that makes the decision harder. But yet the Lord said, if you love anybody more than me, you're not worthy. So don't put anybody between you and the Lord.
Habitation built by the living God for all of every nation who seek that grand abode, a city with foundations firm as the eternal throne, nor wars nor desolations shall